focus on Iran, which continues to be hit hard by COVID-19, with over 80,000 officially reported cases and at least 5,000 deaths, although many suspect those numbers are actually much higher. But even amidst its pandemic crisis, the Iranian regime continues to engage in confrontation with the United States. Now, today, Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps confirmed U.S. claims that last week its gunboats in the Persian Gulf engaged in close contact with U.S. naval ships operating in the northern Gulf near Kuwait. But not surprisingly, Iran puts the blame on American forces, say they were disrupting a drill and blocking Iranian warships. Well, joining us in studio to discuss this, Dr. Fadi Ismail. He's a former senior congressional aide, of course, at the U.S. Congress, and a research fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism, and Kevin Lim, a doctoral researcher in international relations in Tel Aviv University. And Kevin, let's just start with Iran. Its motivations, if we assume this wasn't necessarily an accidental occurrence, in perhaps slightly raising the stakes in the Persian Gulf, and then even coming out and confirming the U.S. report that was made earlier this week?
I think this is part of, this pattern of Iranian behavior that we've seen before. It's nothing new at all. Look, Iran currently is in this, is in a really tight spot. And if you look back all the way back to 1979, at the turn of every decade, Iran has found itself at some kind of an inflection point, whether it's coming from external threats, but often also accompanied by some form of internal instability. And I think it would seem that Iran now currently also once again finds itself on the threshold of another such inflection point. Now, what's important to note also is that at each of these inflection points brought about some kind of change in Iran's way of dealing with the international community. I'm not talking about grand strategic objectives, about conquering, the world and destroying Israel and that sort of thing. I'm just talking about day-to-day, policy and how it relates in terms of trade and diplomacy and security policy. Now we know that since May of last year, there's been this building up of tension. And this would seem to be what happened in the Persian Gulf over the past few days would seem to be a repeat of what was already happening previously in May and then June of last year. Although for many months, if you're talking solely about Iranian ships and American ships coming into close contact, it's been quiet. It's been lulled for many, many months. But that's the thing, because now Iran, when I said inflection point earlier, what I'm basically saying is that Iran's at this point where you've got a lot, regime legitimacy, its top commander has been killed, regime legitimacy is down. You've got a lot of pressures from outside. And Iran, by the way, Iran's support of Shia militias in Iraq continues even after Soleimani's assassination. And so in what's been happening in the Persian Gulf, let me just conclude with this. I think it's just basically saying, listen, the U.S., so long as you don't lift off from and ease off on sanctions on us, we've offered to negotiate, at least the government under Hassan Rouhani. See, as long as you don't do that, we are going to continue putting pressure on you.
Okay, so let's talk about how the U.S. should react there. He mentioned, Kevin mentioned those incidents last year. The U.S. actually, of course, shot down an Iranian drone that even came close here. Some restraint. If the U.S. sees these kind of provocations, what should the reaction be?
Okay, President Trump is under two types of pressures. First of all, those kinds of Iranian, I don't know if call them provocations or just the feeling, America's boundaries. On the other hand, there is a mounting, or used to be a mounting pressure inside the administration as well in Washington to start a war with Iran. There are parties inside D.C. on both political sides, Democrats and Republicans, who want to see a military engagement between the U.S. and Iran. And it is completely outside President Trump's policy, the general policy that he promotes in the region. So he is under those two pressures. I don't think that President Trump is seeking a military confrontation with the Iranians. I'm actually pretty sure he is not. About the other methods, such as sanctions, we have to be careful with that tool, because I recall the days I was already working for the U.S. government during the days of Saddam Hussein. And I remember the issue of sanctions in those days. And a lot of what was said about the sanctions was simply untrue. I know for a fact that there were all the things that were missing for the Iraqi people were available. They were actually...
The Iranian people.
I'm talking those during the days of the Iraqis.
Sorry,
everything was available to the Iraqis. It was already in containers and on ships on its way to Iraq. It was the regime that wouldn't let anything come in, whether it's the insulin for the diabetics or the baby formula for the babies and so on, because the Iraqi regime was using the sanctions as a tool. The same goes for the Iranians. I do not see the mullah regime beyond actually using the sanctions as a tool, and even if you ease the sanctions in some place, they might use it for goals other than helping or humanitarian goals.
Right. Those funds could be fungible and be used for
what I would say, if you want to just drop aid in Iran, whether, I mean, in order to stop corona, all you need is masks and things of that sort. You can do that. We can bring things into Iran in very large numbers that doesn't give the Iranians a dual use.
Right. There may be some technical problems there, but Kevin, there have been some voices, including, for example, former Vice President Joe Biden, who has called for some easing of sanctions just to allow Iran to deal with the coronavirus.
No, I think we have to look at this from two separate perspectives. It really depends what we want to try and achieve. Because here we've got at least two issues on the table. The first is the corona crisis itself. So we know that U.S. sanctions are not the lead cause of Iran's mismanagement. There are many, many causes in Iran's case. But U.S. sanctions certainly do not help. Okay. Now, and then there is the other question of whether we want to reach a kind of a resolution at the political diplomatic level, and that's a different outcome. Now, what I would say is, I don't think Iran, and some have made a case for this, I think Iran probably has sufficient funds. It's got 80-90 billion in terms of foreign currency reserves. It's got its entire, the structure of parastatal bonyats, its charities and foundations, as well as the IRGC's business concerns that that control anything between a third to two-thirds of Iran's economy. So there is money going on there, and you could make a case to say that, listen, let's not. Some have made a case to say let's not ease on the sanctions, but we can do it in a smart way, in the sense that let's make it very, very clear to exporters of medical equipment and so on and so forth that we will not, impede any sort of financial transaction that goes through Iran's central bank, so on and so on. Now, that is corona, and it's morally correct to have. But the other thing, and very quickly, is that if the U.S. wants to reach a financial, resolution, a diplomatic resolution, that's a different thing. And there, if we're talking about easing sanctions as a tool to an end, that's already a different.
Well, that is a different and another complicated discussion. Kevin Lim and Dr. Fadi Ismail, thanks for joining us.